From the Alvin and Rosalie Sarachek studio, PBS Kansas presents Kansas Week.
The state lawmakers say they're looking for ways to save you money, at the very least, back to school shopping. Plus, how one major business project in eastern Kansas may have sparked a lot of interest in our state from companies around the world. But first, the fight over abortion heats up again as one lawmaker suggests moving it to the local level. That's what we're talking about right now on Kansas Week. I'm Pilar Pedraza, and this is Kansas Week. Kansas Republicans are keeping their promise to keep pushing bills limiting abortion in our state. This week, a bill from one of the state's newest senators suggesting we let local communities make the decision. Republican Senator Chase Blasey of Wichita has introduced a bill which would allow cities and counties to enact abortion restrictions on their own. In an interview with the KSN Capitol Bureau, Blasey said he introduced the bill on behalf of his constituents. The fight for life continues in Kansas, he said. In my district, I have many constituents that are very concerned still about the unborn in our state, and so I introduced legislation today to be had with local constituents, local government, Blasey said. Blasey sits on the state's Senate Federal and State Affairs Committee and introduced the bill Thursday to his fellow committee members. This comes after nearly 60% of Kansas voters rejected an abortion amendment last year that would have allowed lawmakers to further restrict abortion rights. Blasey said his bill would allow the abortion issue to be handled at the local level. State law currently forbids local governments from imposing further restrictions or safeguards on the abortion industry, Blasey said. And so this bill, if adopted, would allow the conversation to be had on a more local level. A lot to unpack there. Here to help us do that, we have Republican State Representative Stephen Owens from Heston and David Seaton, managing editor of the Cowley Courier-Traveler, here on the desk with me. And joining us by Zoom, we've got State Senator Cindy Holscher, an Overland Park Democrat. And Cindy, I know that you did some interviews right after this was introduced, so I'm going to start with you. You had a pretty strong reaction to this bill.
Well, I guess my reaction wasn't necessarily one of surprise, but I guess my response is mainly based upon the fact that less than 6 months ago, we heard from the general public in regard to their feelings on having access to reproductive health care. And overwhelmingly, they showed us that that was important. Interestingly, I think the voters believe this issue is settled. But obviously, if some of the same legislators return or some of the same individuals return to the legislature who have been pushing this issue, it's going to keep coming back. So like I said, I wasn't really surprised that the bill was brought forward. But like I said, I think the general public is.
Okay, general public. David, I'm going to come to you. Do you think that a bill like this is much of a surprise to your readers?
Well, it's a surprise to me, so I kind of share the same sentiments. Although when you think about it, you kind of could foresee some attempt to try to push forward the right to life cause after that pretty big failure over the summer with the constitutional amendment. It sounds a little crazy to me, like how would it be managed, jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And then there's the constitutional the question at the state level. I mean, what could they be allowed to do in certain? I mean, you could have Western Kansas forbidding it, and then the population centers allowing it, and it seems that it would create too much division and uncertainty and disconnect within our state. I think, like the senator said, the voters across the state as a whole, if we are a unified state, soundly rejected the idea of imposing more restrictions on abortion.
Stephen, I'm going to give you the floor.
Well, I'll tell you, I don't necessarily agree with some of the comments here. To be honest, I still believe Kansas is a pro-life state. I have no doubt in my mind. I think what was soundly rejected was the overturning of Roe v. Wade, which happened shortly before. What I heard from many of my constituents, even on the conservative Republican side, was their fear that the legislature would go too far, that they would outright ban it completely, even though I don't believe that that was the intent for many people. And so for them, with the safeguard, that backdrop of Roe being overturned, it threw a lot of people into question. You couple that with the tens of millions of dollars of out-of-state money that flowed in here, the messages that were turned on their head. And not saying that I necessarily agree or disagree with this legislation, but I think those of us that remain confidently pro-life will continue to have this conversation going forward.
Well, and talking about continuing to have this conversation moving forward, you and I both know Senator Blasey. We've known him for several years because for both of us, he's worked in the Senate President's office for a number of years now. I can't imagine that this bill was introduced without some sort of leadership blessing on it.
I wouldn't necessarily say that.
No?
It's not to say that the conversations didn't happen, but we have to remember that as a legislator, you have the inherent right to introduce any legislation you want, and there's absolutely nobody that can stop that. I could introduce legislation that says sky's purple on Tuesday, and the revisers are going to write it because that's my authority to do so. So I wouldn't necessarily agree with that. I think only time will tell, right, whether it gets hearings and begins to get through the process and what that looks like as to whether or not there was actually a blessing by leadership.
Well, I tell you, you write that bill that says the sky is purple on Tuesday, I will come testify as a proponent.
All right, sounds good.
Well, more concerns about your water here in Kansas, adding to the state's problem with how much or little water we've got underground, especially in western Kansas. More and more Kansans now facing unsafe drinking water. That's the latest on the state's water crisis Cake News Investigates has been telling you about. The director of the Kansas Water Office briefed lawmakers on the problem Tuesday morning. She was referring to the number of communities like Pretty Prairie that are struggling to deal with potentially dangerous levels of nitrates in their drinking water. The Water Office says those nitrates often come from fertilizer and water runoff. For many communities, the only answer is to put in a water treatment plant, which can cost anywhere from $1,100 to as much as $19,000 per person, man, woman, and child in the community.
The supplier is then responsible for making sure that water is clean. So maybe water comes into the city, it's a real problem. The city is obligated to clean it up, to pass it on to its customers. Well, that can cost millions upon millions of dollars that little small communities just simply don't have.
Pretty Prairie, a Reno County town of 650 people, had to pay $2 million to get a new osmosis water treatment plant after more than 3 decades dealing with the nitrates. Owen said smaller Kansas communities in about 3/4 of the state are now dealing with that same problem. And Stephen, we know some of those communities in your district, and it's a growing problem, more and more communities every year.
Yeah, water rights and access to water, we know is, I mean, it's the future. It's the only way that our state survives, especially western Kansas that already struggles. I mean, we're an agricultural state, and with that, you have that additional demand beyond what people need as a drinking water. I'm really excited to have Chairman Jim Minix, who's chairing the Water Committee, who is from western Kansas, who's a farmer who has an inherent understanding of the crisis that we face. But there's no easy answer. There's no hot button, really easy solution to this problem. I think it's going to come down to various different things, from conservation to looking at different ways to increase access. And then the fights are going to happen. Like you mentioned, Wichita trying to get water rights out of Harvey County, and the pushback and that ongoing battle over the last 2 years. A lot of challenges as it relates to water.
A lot of questions out there. And Cindy, we know we've got the House Water Committee. We know that there's a joint committee between the House and the Senate looking at this. But outside of the folks on that on those committees, does it seem like there's growing urgency amongst lawmakers to tackle this issue?
I certainly hope so. When I first entered the legislature, I was in the House for 2 terms. I was on the Water Committee, and this was something we looked at very intently. We had a great water plan developed. Unfortunately, at that time, this was 2017, there was no money to invest into it. So a good water plan does take a substantial investment. And you know, unfortunately, some of the problems are kind of catching up with us at this point, because we've been able to see some of this coming. So it's a concerning situation. But I do think about the fact that, you know, we really need to be looking at alternatives too. And, you know, right now, we have a medicinal cannabis bill getting ready to be introduced, passed the House last session. That's a crop that requires less water, typically requires less pesticides and less treatment. So we really need to seriously take a look at some of these alternatives to help address the situation overall.
Okay, you brought something up. I'm going to take a right turn here real quick. You said there's about to be a medicinal marijuana bill introduced. Now, I've spoken with folks at the House. They said they did their bit last year. They're not going to start the ball. It's in the Senate's court. Do you see this actually happening this year?
My understanding is the House is waiting on the Senate to basically lead the way, because you're right. The House did a great job last year drafting a bill and passing it. And unfortunately, the bill was not picked up in the Senate. So I know that a bill is being drafted. Hopefully it gets introduced soon. There's been some switching around of committee chairs. So keeping my fingers crossed that the bill gets a hearing. But yeah, like I said, that the House did their part last time and passed a really good bill. So we need to, in the Senate, be very serious about taking a look at that bill and working to catch up with the rest of the Midwest.
All right. Got to be careful what you say. I will catch those little items.
You guys are probably sick and tired of talking about medical marijuana. Just pass it, would you?
It's been an ongoing conversation for a long time,
Yeah.
and requires a lot of debate to ensure we get it right.
Well, and we were talking about the water issue, and there's the quality, the rights, there's the cost versus access that's going on, and going to be increasingly a problem for every Kansan, really, because we all are going to have to pay for it.
And I had a question about the Pretty Prairie situation and the nitrates in the water. Do we know that whether that's connected to the depletion of the aquifer? I don't know, is that part and parcel of what's going on? Poor water quality as the
No, from
aquifer
my
gets
understanding, this is
depleted?
actually a separate issue, but kind of related.
They kind of go together, yeah.
Basically, with there being less water in the ground, in the aquifers, there's thus less water available for irrigation. So the ground, and we're in drought, which makes the ground hard. So when rains come, when irrigation does happen, instead of soaking into the ground, it tends to run off.
Yeah, so it can be
and
connected,
take
yeah.
the nitrates from the fertilizer with it.
Well, I think that was part of the complaint about what's going on in California now with all the heavy rains, is so much of that good water is not being captured, is being run out to sea.
Yeah.
You know, it wasn't but, 6-8 years ago that our aquifer under this area was so full they couldn't even recharge it, which Wichita has a recharging facility with their whole credit system. And so it's crazy to see those fluctuations and how dramatic that effect has been. Here, I think it's a concern. Western Kansas, it's dire.
It's an emergency. Yeah. All right. Well, moving on, we learned this week the big incentive package Kansans are paying for to bring a Panasonic battery factory to town is drawing attention from other companies. The Department of Commerce today asked lawmakers to extend the Apex legislation for another year. Panasonic is just now pouring the concrete footing of its new factory that it expects will employ some 4,000 Kansans. But the state says there are already 6 other companies looking for similar deals. Combined, those 6 projects could add up to an investment of nearly $12.5 billion in the state and the creation of almost 6,500 jobs.
From a media standpoint, it was pretty high profile, and it echoed within the economic development community that Kansas had done something significant.
We're expanding this before we even know the fallout, is what you're asking for here, which I find interesting. And I say fallout because of a couple of things that were in the legislation. We still don't know the final price tag.
The Department of Commerce says we won't know the total cost of the incentives to Panasonic for about 5 years. 6,500 jobs at a time when a lot of employers actually are kind of struggling to find workers. I don't know about your community, but we're doing that story a lot here in the metro area. You have to wonder, do we need those jobs at this point?
Well, it's hard to turn down a big project that attracted
Yes, very,
jobs,
very
especially high-paying jobs. I think the representative who we just heard from, offers a decent critique. You know, you want to make sure that these are structured right, that we don't spend more than we receive, and that's probably impossible to predict in the end. From sort of, I think, the average citizen's viewpoint, when you start seeing that these big companies are getting these big breaks and incentives, it sort of makes, hey, wait a minute, what about the small business person? And I sometimes covering municipal government. There's a lot of property tax exemptions to lure and attract and retain businesses or for expansion, and they have to. The city commission or county commission has to put together a cost-benefit analysis whether or not this will bring in more taxes and economic development than they're paying out, and they don't have to show a positive benefit to approve the project. But in my reporting of these and looking at these things, I don't think they pay much attention to those things. And in fact, in one time I took a real close look at one of them, and they kept revising the report as I would ask questions. And so I sort of lost faith that, at least that sometimes, anyway, this is just one small example, that on the local level anyway, and maybe, who knows, the state level, that these things are moving targets, and it's hard to really understand what the economic benefit's going to be in the end.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about a potential of $1 billion, and some of that literally being a refundable credit going to Panasonic or anybody else that accesses the Apex bill. Statistic in my committee last week that there are 2.5 jobs for every one unemployed person in the state of Kansas right now. We have areas, and I heard this from Kansas Department of Corrections, where they have 100 openings and only 100 unemployed people in that entire county, for perspective. So our job's important, absolutely. Growth, we've got to have it. Economic incentives, I tend to stand with Senator Tyson and say, look, I understand why we need to do this to be competitive. I'm not a fan of incentives, but when every state around us is doing them and growing as a result, it puts the onus on us to do them. But I'm really hesitant to go down the path of let's renew this and let's do possibly 2 or 3 more without knowing what the actual cost of the taxpayer is going to be.
And you keep chasing the incentives; they got to get bigger and bigger, and but you can't. You almost can't not do it. Right?
I almost wish the federal government would outlaw all incentives on every level, because then we'd have a free market, an equal playing field, and so we just don't have that right now.
At the same time, that happens, and I hear the words government overreach so
I know.
fast.
I know.
Cindy, I want to hear your thoughts on this. So, what do you think about how this Panasonic deal is shaping up?
Well, I would tell you the people closest to it in the Gardner area, I mean, and they have the most information about it, undoubtedly excited that this is a great thing for them, their community, their whole region. And, we have a problem with out-migration. So we have to do things to attract strong, good paying jobs in order to keep people here and to attract people here. Because, we have a lot of job openings, but not necessarily job openings that are livable wages. So that's what's important. And of course, any program should really be evaluated, critiqued to see how it's doing. And, the fact of the matter is we have a governor and lieutenant governor and Governor Kelly and Lieutenant Governor Toland, who have some pretty sound judgment in this area. I mean, when we think back to how the situation was 4 years ago when they came into office, the huge deficits, the cuts that have been made to all these different departments, I mean, we're in a phenomenally better position now. So, like I said, to me, that speaks to their good judgment as far as evaluating programs, evaluating what needs to be done out there.
All right. Well, I know you were nodding along with some of that, Stephen. You probably have something you want to say real quick, very quick.
You're 100% right. In many ways, a lot of good things have been done, and we've seen a turning in the interest in our state. It's worth noting, though, that unfortunately we still have yet to recover from the pandemic in the state of Kansas. We still do not have the same number of jobs and employment opportunities, and I think that to get more people in the state, which is ultimately the best solution for anybody, right? The more taxpayers we have, the lower the detriment can be on everybody else. So we need more people. We've got to look at that holistically, and we've got to say, okay, where's our tax structure, for example, which is another conversation. Where are things holistically, and not just here are jobs come.
Okay. Well, and I'm going to stop the conversation there, because talking about taxpayers and tax cuts, how about one that might help just about every family in the state? For the first time, state lawmakers heard details Thursday on a series of bills that would create a sales tax holiday for school supplies in Kansas. The plans would give families some financial relief when going back to school shopping. KAKE's Jackson Overstreet has more on the Senate Taxation Committee hearing on multiple bills that would create that sales tax holiday, most likely in the first week of August.
When you think of holidays, the first thing that probably comes to mind is Christmas or Thanksgiving. But what about sales tax? Thursday, Kansas senators held the first hearing on two bills that would create a sales tax holiday for school supplies in the state.
And I do look forward to working with all the senators on this. I think we'll get a good product.
The concept is pretty straightforward. In the first week of August, the state would not charge sales tax on back-to-school items. Everything from pencils and papers to school clothing and computers.
Especially with clothes and school supplies, backpacks, all that. It can add up really quick.
Stephanie Trotter has a son in grade school and says being able to save even just a little bit on these items would be a big help.
Anything, to help us save money or cut corners would absolutely help parents, especially parents that are living paycheck to paycheck. So, yeah, it would help us a lot.
Both Republicans and Democrats showing an interest in creating the exemption. As right now, the state has a record $2 billion surplus in revenue. A third bill creating a sales tax holiday was also introduced Wednesday and is supported by Governor Laura Kelly.
This shouldn't be a partisan issue. This should be an issue that brings everybody together to do what's in the best interest of our kids, our parents, our teachers. And the school sales tax holiday is just that.
And Cindy, this is something that the governor has been pushing, your party has been pushing, so I'm going to come to you first. Your thoughts? We've got several different bills out there. It almost seems like the argument isn't over whether it should happen, but how. What are the details?
Yeah, and there's a lot of choices out there as far as where we can give tax breaks, and again, we need to use really sound judgment as we move forward. And to me, sales tax holidays, that's a great thing as far as helping working families. People on fixed incomes need help, so to me that makes a lot of sense. Additionally, I am hopeful that we will go ahead and totally eliminate the sales tax on food, because we know that we have the revenue. We could have done it sooner, and instead of doing the phase-in approach, because our families out there who are living paycheck to paycheck really need that break. So I am hopeful that we can go ahead and get that job done this year.
All right, Stephen, supermajority, do you think it's going to happen?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, this is a piece of legislation I started to introduce 4 years ago, was a sales tax holiday on school supplies. And so something that I've always been very supportive of. I'm not sure that the actual data supports it being as beneficial as what we think it will be, but regardless, it'll provide relief. In today's economy with inflation and everything else, we have got to do everything we can to return some of that money to the taxpayers. We've got to do everything we can to right our current tax system as a whole, to say, okay, 2017, $1.2 billion in increases. 2 years before that, we increased sales tax an entire %, right? We also need to be looking at holistically, not just these piecemeal approaches, but things that are going to lower people's taxable income and tax bills overall.
And I know as a parent, I used to spend hundreds of dollars every year getting one child ready for back to school. I can't imagine with multiple kids, as most Kansas families have.
Yeah, and apparently this legislation also applies to clothes and computers, and so it's not just the little. Yeah. So that makes it more, I think, probably worthwhile to parents. In researching this, I found it interesting that these proposals have been introduced since at least back to like 2015, and so I pulled up an old story where the League of Municipalities at the time, I lost my earpiece there, was against it. And I could read. I'm not going to read this quote here, but not sound tax policy. Don't want to lose any more revenue. I think at the time that state tax revenues weren't as strong. Right. Now apparently the League of Municipalities is for it, and so it's interesting how things change over time depending on maybe the political atmosphere and probably the revenue position of the state too. Yeah. So but I sort of agree with Representative Owens in general. It seems like we give away these little sort of tax holiday treats and incentives to people without looking at the big picture, and whether it benefits the state overall is uncertain. Yeah.
Right.
And I think that's one thing we can all agree on in Topeka, Republican, Democrat alike, is that Kansans need tax breaks. Kansans need more money in their pockets as a result of the inflation.
All right, I'm going to leave that one there. One more thing to talk about today. The family of a murdered Hayes woman asking state lawmakers for help plugging a loophole in state law that could allow murderers to use money inherited from their victims to pay for their own defense in court. Karen May Forsyth Schumacher died last March.
This is my sister.
Her family says her husband killed her after 4 decades of verbally and physically abusing her.
She said, Sue, he started punching me in the head, and she showed me how he did it. 1, 2, 1, 2, like a boxing bag.
Her sister Susan says over the decades, those punches caused brain damage.
They did a brain scan. She had 10 permanent spots of brain damage, equivalent to boxers.
And in the end, killed her. According to the criminal complaint against her husband, Jay Naldo Schumacher, last March, he hit her in the head and the body so many times he caused trauma and internal bleeding that led to death.
On March 22nd, my mother was murdered. My dad was the one that killed her. allegedly.
So why did Karen's son and sister end up sitting in a State House committee room instead of a courtroom Tuesday? Because J. Naldo Schumacher was named as the beneficiary on all Karen's assets, bank accounts, retirement savings, everything, legally free to use the money however he wanted. They think that should change.
When he was arrested for her murder, he easily could have come up with the bond if the assets were not frozen.
Why is there nothing to stop this? You know, why can he use everything? He's already been arrested. He's been charged. This doesn't make any sense.
The family had to get a court order because there's no law barring Schumacher from touching any of the money until the criminal case is wrapped up. Now, if convicted, the law will prevent him from inheriting. But Karen's family is asking lawmakers to close that loophole between arrest and conviction. Automatically freeze the assets when a spouse or domestic partner stands accused of killing the one they should have loved.
But that's why we're here, why I'm here, you know. I don't see this helping me in any way, shape, or form. I mean, I don't. But someone down the line, it's going to help.
The lawmakers didn't have many questions, mostly about technicalities of how this proposed change would work. No one testified against the bill. And in fact, it had bipartisan support going in. And really the question here is a bigger one about legal loopholes. And you and I were talking about this before the show started, how sometimes you don't realize until a situation comes up like this.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is an epic tragedy. And this is something that I think we can all agree on needs to be fixed. I sat in on this hearing. I heard that testimony. I felt that emotion. And it is absolutely tragic. And I think we can fix it.
And Cindy, this is starting in the House, but has to get through the Senate as well. Again, something that feels like it transcends party lines.
No, yeah, I mean, undoubtedly, to me, this seems like a no-brainer, and I'm sure it does to the general public that, yeah, this needs to be done. And, you know, to your point, sometimes we don't realize there's an issue until we have a real-life situation where it's affected somebody. So, you know, that's what we're looking at here. And I'm going to tell you, I make a very selfish segue here. The same way that this to many people would seem like, yes, of course you need to fix this. Same situation with the statute of limitations bill, which has bipartisan support. When you talk to the people, the general public about these types of issues, the statute of limitations bill would take away those timeframes that prohibit victims of childhood sexual abuse from moving forward with their cases. So when you talk to people about that topic, they're like, of course there shouldn't be statute of limitations.
And Cindy, I'm going to have to interrupt you. We're out of time. Folks who are interested in more information on that, check out last week's episode on YouTube. For now, stay safe and have a great week.